Hello, I'm Aaron Pabon with Game Journalism Network. Joining me for an interview on Google Hangouts is Oliver Campbell. Oliver Campbell is a former games journalist and is actively a part of the SPJ Airplay event. Mr. Campbell, how are you doing today?
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Full disclosure before we begin this interview, I've previously spoken with Mr. Campbell on two separate live streams, both of which involving the Airplay event, where I also spoke my 2 cents on there, and there will be links available below after this video. And also, I am actively participating in the Airplay event, helping out with another member, John Smith. So, full disclosure aside, as we're trying to do these, promote ethics in gaming journalism, figured I'd do my due diligence. Mr. Campbell, let's start with what's been going on currently with Airplay, because over the past I would say 2 weeks, if I'm correct, 2 weeks, there's been a little bit of controversy surrounding it. Can you care to give me a TLDR of what's been going on?
Well, essentially what's been happening with Airplay is, if people aren't familiar, it's being organized by Michael Koretsky, who is the Region 3 director for the Society of Professional Journalists, and that covers some of the southern states such as Florida. He's been putting together this event to get a very formalized Gamergate debate / panel going on. And of course, as he's going through and putting this together, he talks about the things that he's found and the things that he's researched into Gamergate and the types of people and personalities that he's met. In one of his previous updates, the one in question that kind of got people riled up a little bit, he was talking about the narrative of harassment that is perpetuated the majority of mainstream media regarding Gamergate. And one thing that he kind of wanted clear is to make sure that no one was going to be engaged in any kind of harassing behaviors, I suppose I would say, in the online space. And Michael Koretsky is kind of an interesting fellow in my experiences of dealing with him, in that he's got a style of maybe humor or a style of speech in which he navigates conversations very carefully in the way that he says things. And when I read the update, I didn't see an issue with what he was saying personally. But because I've been dealing with Gamergate for so long, I could understand where people were reading what he was saying and becoming frustrated from that, and of course seeing that it seems like a focus on harassment. And so what I did was I sat down and I got on the phone with him, and we just kind of got into a phone call and did a little back and forth so I could kind of clear that up. The way that I described it for people was that I've been around the internet for some time, just being close to my mid-30s at this point. And so I'm used to having seen where some different types of cultures have grown and developed, and especially Chan cultures and things like that. In the conversation that I had with him, I made the kind of a metaphor that I'm bilingual, in the sense that, well, I was a journalist, so I speak journalist and understand what he's saying, but I've been around Chan boards, I've been around those different communities and seen how they talk amongst each other and how that's a separate language in itself. And so I kind of made it a point to, translate between the two so that everyone can understand what each side is saying. And as I had this conversation with him and explained that why he may be getting reactions the way that he does, is that people who have been involved with Gamergate for the past 10 months are used to hit piece after hit piece after hit piece against them. They're used to getting hatchet jobs where people are very much so cherry picking information or not telling the whole story, and they're very afraid. And they're basically becoming gun shy, to where if any journalist approaches them, they're assuming ill intent, and so it makes them very nervous. And when I explained that to him, he kind of ended up saying, I hadn't even taken that into consideration. Now things are starting to make a little bit more sense. And so what we ended up doing was we sat down and together decided to put together as long as it took stream, which ended up being about 6 hours long. And we had just, I think at last count was about 20 different people jump into a hangout with us and answered people's questions about Airplay, and people could go over his motives and the things that people felt that he was doing wrong, as well as sourcing questions from the Chan communities and Reddit et al. That was, well, really, really, really long, and no one expected that. But I did notice the environment calmed down significantly once people could get some real face time in there. And no matter how small that people felt that they were, that they could get in there, ask a question or ask several questions, and really, get to know each other is pretty much what it did more than anything else.
Right, because we also had a lot of people who were not 100% familiar with the SPJ event. A lot of people thought this was specifically just going to be a pro Gamergate event, and a lot of people didn't seem to be aware that journalists are actually going to be at this event, covering it, asking questions, and it's also going to be journalism students. Because I've met Koretsky in the past. And I've actually, when I was in college, I met him when he was also an advisor for various college newspapers, and he makes these events for educational reasons. And a lot of people really didn't seem to understand that. And I did mention that in the stream before. But the biggest issue has been is a lot of people still haven't seemed to understand what the entire event is going to be. And please correct me if I'm wrong. This is a journalism event that we are specifically talking about Gamergate, and we are hoping to get both sides of the argument at play here, which is both the pro and anti side.
That's correct. I think that's one of the most important things. When I first, I don't know how I would describe this, not joined up, because there's nothing to join. I would say when I first became very vocal about Gamergate 10 months back, one of my stated purposes was, well, showing up to help with the ethical conundrum that's been going around. And for me, doing Airplay is a huge goal. I mean, when you can get more or less the biggest journalism association in the United States to go, yeah, let's talk about Gamergate and let's get this stuff out there so that we can start sorting this stuff out, I guess would be a way to describe it. I think that's really, really important. Airplay will cover a lot of different aspects that I think that some people haven't considered. Just as you said, there will be journalism students there who are going to be participating and will also help manage things, such as they'll be hosting multiple streams of the event. There will be proper journalists there. Members of the public will be there. And I think the important thing is that we are going to be able to demystify a lot of topics for them. We'll be able to factually prove many of the accusations and allegations that have been made against Gamergate as patently false. And for people who have been involved with Gamergate, I think that they're going to be in a situation where they're going to get to finally present their own accusations and allegations and have them heard. Now, I don't think that every accusation and allegation that people involved with Gamergate have made may or may not stand up to scrutiny. But the point is that this is the conversation that should have happened 10 months back. And at that point, it will be a year, and it will show just in and of itself that there was a colossal failing in the reporting media to adequately cover this. It's, as I said, a discussion that should have happened a year back.
Right. Of course, one of the key issues that has happened in the past 2 weeks was because of the mention of is the harassment narrative going to be talked about? Now, journalistically speaking, and I'm saying this as a journalist, is it does need to be briefly addressed because it is a small factor when it comes to Gamergate, but that is not the whole whole situation as a whole. And here on this YouTube channel, we will briefly talk about it way later on down the road. It's going to be probably a one-off video because it is an issue, but this is not the key issue when it comes to Gamergate. But does it need to be addressed at SPJ at any point, specifically since we're trying to talk about ethics in journalism? Is this something that, as a journalist, we have to mention briefly so people have the whole context of the story?
In my opinion, yes, to a point. It's just as you said. There's two key things about this. One, Gamergate is not about the harassment of women, and it's not about the harassment of people on the internet. This is that's just true. That's what Gamergate was not formed around, these ideas. It does not focus on those concepts, anything like that. However, the media narrative is about harassment of people in the game industry. And in order to adequately tell this story, it is something that must be talked about in a limited construct. And I guess the easiest way to describe that is that I'm going to be on that panel, and I'm going to be talking about ethics, and I'm going to be talking about the various events that have happened over the year at that point. However, if you were to talk about Gamergate, we must provide the information from the historical sense of going, Gamergate came and had these concerns about ethics, and the media response to this was, well, this is just about harassing women. In order to adequately tell that story, we must say, well, this is what they said, and these are the actions that they took. This is how they decided to approach that situation. Here are the accusations and allegations that they made. And then again, I can give the historical responses that Gamergate had to those very things. And so we have to look at this from the sense that all of this stuff needs to be talked about, if only for the people who are going, what's Gamergate? I've never heard of this before. And it's all just going to be kind of laid out there on the table. From my own point of view, it's really easy to dismantle that narrative. I mean, just to make a light joke, I mean, I feel like I could walk in there and dismantle that within about 5-10 minutes and kind of go on with things. But it is a part of the history of Gamergate as something that happened. Someone said this. It would be no different than, say, I don't know, you could have someone walking down the street and they're snatched up by the police and they're accused of robbing a bank, but they had nothing to do with that, right? And later on, someone's going to say, well, what happened? Well, you don't leave out the part where the accusation was made about, yeah, the police came and arrested me for, an allegation that I robbed a bank. Like, you still have to tell that part because that is part of the story. But just because the accusation was made, the allegation was made, it doesn't mean that it was true. And we're not going to, at least in my opinion, I'm not going to focus on, perpetuating the lie, but I'm going to go ahead and put down that, the accusation and the allegation was made, and here are the things that disprove that. Let's move on.
Understood. And that's actually been one of the key issues that I've noticed, is that we're also living in a situation where a lot of people don't really seem to understand how journalism is supposed to work. And we have to address all these situations so everybody has a clear idea of, how we got from point A to point B. And we still need to figure out, what happened in between. That includes mentioning allegations. That includes mentioning, this small factor happened, but that's still a key part in this history, but it builds to a bigger part of the situation at play. This also brings up an interesting point when it comes to journalism, is the situation we're in now. We're looking for a push for ethics in gaming journalism, but I've been looking at the history since I'm watching Gamergate unfold since almost day one. And it's only now I'm really getting into the fray of this. I'm still so astounded that there was a massive institutional failure in journalism in this capacity. In your opinion, or what do you think happened? Why are we really in this situation? Obviously, we've had posts before. We have people talking about how there's conflicts of interest, but how could something like this happen? in such a large capacity?
It's really complex. It's very complicated, and I've been looking at it and studying it for pretty much the past 10 months, same as you, and of course, trying to keep track of the things that happened before. And there's multiple levels of failing that have occurred here. I think that lax standards, as usual, is with many different failings in life, are a key component here. But it also says quite a bit about the public at large. And when you look at this, it tells us a lot about how the public interacts with the media. It tells us the expectations that the public have of the media, and that oh god, I'm trying to think of the word right off the top of my head here. Just a general, I guess, an expectation, and there's credibility that's led to the media by default. It's pretty easy to say that the people who are involved with Gamergate are people who do not take what the media says at face value. Maybe they did at one point, but they don't anymore. And it's a different type of thing where someone is doing the news and the story is about you or things that you personally know about or you were involved in, and you can go, but that's not true. I know because I was there, or it's about me, or I experienced it, or or I have a firsthand account of that thing. And I think that's one of the issues. And many of the people, just as I said, that have been involved with Gamergate saw this stuff personally. They watched it happen over the past 10 months. I've sat here and watched, different stories come out that are either incredibly slanted, or they are factually removing information that's not convenient to the type of story that they want to run. And that's a huge failure. So with me, one of the things that I saw, and this is just a kind of a personal anecdote, was shortly after I started talking about Gamergate. Obviously I had, like anyone else, I have friends, and I was going, wow, story isn't true. Like, I went and did my own research. I did my own investigation into this, and it is so far off the mark that it's not even funny. And all of my friends know that I did journalism, but what really shocked and bothered me was I said this, and they didn't care. They were just like, no, this is about harassing women. This is about this. And I'm like, but I was a journalist. You've seen my work, and when you look at it that way, and I'm like, I'm telling you as a journalist that other journalists are not doing their job properly, and they ignored that because there's that expectation that what the media tells you is always true without slant. There can't possibly be any bias. Oh no, that person would never have an agenda. Well, that's not true. We've seen it happen before. It's happened many times before. And now we're starting to get a much better understanding of how we got there. So there's kind of a failing in the public trust, in where we are to this point where the media, as a whole, the news media, has a certain amount of trust that they've no longer earned. And I think that they need to make great efforts to win that trust back and to win that credibility back. I believe that Gamergate is here because of the media's failing, as in not, when I say it's here, I mean still here 10 months down the line, where the conversation that we're having now and the event with Airplay that's going to go down, if those things had happened within the first week, if it had happened within the first 2 weeks or even 3 weeks, we might not be here still having this conversation. But in the failure to address and going, our audience, the people that give us views, the people that give us traffic, the people that give us prominence, they're angry with us. It's hundreds of thousands of people are very angry, and we should be trying to do everything possible to help satiate the group, to get them to calm down and to be in a position where we can have this conversation and go, how, it's clear that, in your opinion, we're failing to serve you to a level of expectation. what can we do to address that? But that's not the response that was given. Instead, people were met with derision. They were met with scorn. They were met with really hateful things. And as people in Gamergate would be familiar with now, for many of them, their identities as gamers was eliminated in a sense, in a huge, seemingly coordinated media hit, and that just made them more angry. Like, what I guess one way to look at it is, if a house is on fire and you want the house to stop burning, stop pouring gasoline on it. Like, there's something that you could do that's not the thing that you're currently doing, because right now the things that have gone down, they're not helping. They've constantly made the situation worse, and I think that it's really, really telling of what's going on here, and the kind of the lack of self-awareness as professionals, when they can't go, okay, we've been at this for almost a year. This hasn't gone away. Maybe we should try something else. But it also shows many of the weaknesses that are in play with the video game industry at large. Video games have mostly been a very self-regulated industry, in the sense that we have the ESRB in order to rate video games here in the United States, and of course they have the PEGI ratings in the UK. But one of the reasons that we have the ESRB, and we started getting ratings on games, if people remember this, was to help prevent government oversight. And by policing itself, well, it made sure that no one could come in heavy-handed and start controlling content, things like that. Journalism, obviously, Aaron, is the same way, because of the First Amendment and freedom of speech and freedom of the press, things like that here in the United States. So you've got this video game industry that basically self-regulates, and you've got press organizations that also self-regulate in the United States. But I think partially because of that self-regulation, well, you are going to always have a situation every now and again where bad actors and people with ill intents are going to end up in positions where they can influence things to go the way that they want them to go, and can kind of skirt around standards, and there's no one to enforce those things. Like, when I say enforcement, I mean there's really no heavy-handed enforcement. And so Gamergate is kind of the natural response to the lack of enforcement in those areas, where ultimately a reporter, a journalist, anyone, they answer to their viewership, they answer to their readers. It doesn't matter if you're just doing a blog type of reporting or if you're doing YouTube. John Q. Public is your boss. And if John Q. Public isn't happy, well, you've got a bit of a situation on your hands.
See, and I do agree completely. But one of the other situations we have with this is also that we have people who are working within the video game journalism industry who don't really seem to understand the rules of journalism. They don't seem to understand why we have these self-governed rules. And some of them are even open with saying that they will push an agenda. They will help their friends out. And they don't really seem to understand what's wrong here. And that's something that I've been also trying to understand is, well, why are they thinking that? And I have a theory, which is, many of these people have studied journalism. Because if you study journalism, they teach you what not to do almost immediately. You don't push agendas. You don't try to help your friends out. If you feel you're in a conflict of interest, you mention this. You recruit yourself to your editor, and you're not going to lose your job over this. You're probably just going to get the story reassigned, or they might ask, well, how close are you to this conflict of interest? Is it, close friend? Are you in a relationship with somebody? Is this going to affect the story? Please explain how. And then they might just say, well, write the story, but explain to your viewers how you relate to this person. I still just don't seem to understand why this is happening like this.
Well, just as you said, when we take a look at this stuff and why we have those standards in place, when I first started discussing Gamergate, I did so on a Twitch.tv stream. Because people sat down, they said, we're hearing the things that you're saying, and we want to know more about it. and please get on some sort of video so that you can really hit your talking points a lot faster. And so I got on, and during that first stream I was talking to probably about 2,000 people, which blew my mind. And as I just kind of went over my own career and talked about, well, those standards and things like that, the thing that really surprised me was how unaware of those standards and those ethics policies and things that the general public was. They really had limited information and knowledge on that stuff. And so I spent a lot of that stream, I think it was 9 hours long. I spent a lot of that stream just explaining why we have those standards and why we have those policies in place. And I basically was just kind of reconciling their complaints against the ethics standards and policies that I knew, and how to put those things together so that they could kind of have a more cohesive discussion and understand how those two things tie together. For those who are watching or listening to this and not kind of understanding, the way that I explained ethics in shorthand was to say, well, an ethics standard comes into place for one of two or possibly both reasons. I said, one, it's either because something hypothetical could happen where a conflict of interest or it's just not a best practice could go down. Or two, it's a response to something that already has happened. It's either it could possibly happen or it has happened, and you're trying to deal with those two things. And the reason that we have these standards in place, they're best practices. And if people don't understand, like, the word ethics in and of itself, it's a form of morality, essentially, for professionalism. Again, that's just a shorthand way to describing it. And going, well, we should do this, but not this because this. And many different professions have these type of standards. They have a type of ethics standard, even if it's just what's our work ethic. People have all kinds of standards like that. Just like we use the word, hey, here's a good work ethic, right? And what would a good work ethic be? Well, it would be the best practices for being a responsible person with a job. Show up on time to work. Don't take longer breaks than necessary. Make sure you're actually staying on task. Report into your boss, let them know about schedule changes, things like that. It's an ethic, the best practices for being a good employee. And when we're dealing with such high-end trust professions, as I like to call them like this, ethical standards are even more important than I would say your typical job, simply because lives change and are grossly affected by the things that occur in this profession, whether people realize it or not. When you look at a doctor, and many people would be familiar with the basic ethics standards and practices of the medical profession, we talk about things like the Hippocratic Oath, things such as do no harm. Well, if people don't understand what that do no harm they don't understand what that means, well, that can create a certain amount of confusion and frustration. For example, when the key part of the Hippocratic Oath, just like I said, do no harm. Well, when you go into the doctor's office and they say, okay, we're going to have to draw blood, well, that's a type of harm, isn't it? Someone's sticking a needle under your skin and they're drawing blood out of you, and chances are that's probably going to hurt. But what they're saying with that standard of do no harm, it's really do no unreasonable harm outside of what is necessary to treat your patient. So I have to draw your blood simply because there's information about what's going on with you in your blood. I need it. That's the only way that we can currently get it, and it's following through on that. When we look at journalism in a similar scope, we also have similar rules to try not to do any more harm than necessary in order to cover the story. If there's a public interest story, or for example, going on with a public figure, there are things that you're going to have to talk about, that things that people publicly know, or things that people publicly want to talk about. What's unreasonable as a journalist is you don't go break into someone's house and then go rifling through their stuff and then try to justify it through, oh, I'm covering the story. No, that's unreasonable. You
Right.
get the information that you can within the public space or whoever's going to talk to you. So that's kind of one way to look at it.
Because
And
one thing I'm sorry to
no, go ahead.
interrupt. When I studied journalism, one of the key things was always been, well, at one point do you cover the story, and when do you not cover the story? Like, for example, this was a big deal during the Vietnam War. Was journalists were put in a situation where, do we report exactly where we are and expose where our troops are, or do we say we're just in Vietnam and the story? And those are situations where, are you going to put lives in danger, or are you going to or are you going to say information that the public needs to know? Because if I wanted to, I could go online, I could look up the plans for how an atomic bomb works. That's public information, it's publicly available. And that's if I want to look for it. But as a journalist, I wouldn't print how to make this device, because I don't know how the public would respond to this. I don't know if I don't know if someone out there would actually attempt to make this device. So that's where we have to put ourselves in check of the whole, well, when do we not, and how do we disseminate which information is the most important?
Correct. It is just about, as you said, it's that doing no harm as much as possible in order to secure the story and get the information out there on a level that people can understand and make decisions. One of the most frustrating parts about just game journalism and watching this and seeing how things are affected over the past 10 months, we've seen many game developers, we've seen various public figures be kind of attacked in the media. They've been, dragged through the mud. I'm sure many people who are here who may be listening to this who have been involved with Gamergate are familiar with the Brad Wardell story, who is the CEO of Stardock. And he had a court trial that went on for a little bit that was kind of rooted in sexual harassment claims. And these many of these outlets went and ran the story with a presumption of guilt, that whatever the accusation was, he must have done it. And of course, the trial went ahead and went on, and it ended up being a settled case, but it wasn't in his, or not in his favor. That's not the word I want to use. He wasn't the one who had to settle. It was actually the plaintiff, and she had to make a public apology to him, among other things.
Right.
And
And we
people
have
failed to update and correct that story.
I'm sorry. And there we had a clear situation where people were saying he did it without any due diligence or proof. And we had people in the gaming press saying this person may have done it without any proof whatsoever.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why we have to be so careful with our words as journalists, because our words are our product. They are the things that we use to communicate with the public with. This is what they show up for, our way with words and how we go about describing things. And there's the reason that we use words such as accused of, or allegedly, supposedly, and that we aren't supposed to be there to render judgment. In a sense, it's to, just as we talked about, to inform and give people the basic idea of what's going on. This person is accused of doing this action, or it is alleged that they are involved in the middle of a scandal, or things like that. And we'll wait for the rest of the information to come out and come forth before we can report on those things in a defining sense. And so when we see media taking very stern positions on things that have yet to be investigated, or things that have yet to have the story fully come to light, that does warp public perception. It changes the public's point of view. And that's the one thing that I don't think that we're supposed to do, is in tell them how they're supposed to how they're supposed to feel, or tell them what direction they're going to go with whatever current thing is on the table. The way that I described it to people in Gamergate was that journalism changes lives. countries have risen and fallen. Companies have risen and also fallen based on how the media decided to report on those things. And that's a disturbingly dangerous amount of power to have that I think that many people have missed. And they don't realize how much control that is really going on behind those situations like that. Not even talking about game journalism, but just journalism in general. I'm sure people remember the hearing about the mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford,
Right.
and a couple of outlets connected to some known game journalism outlets did quite a bit of reporting on those things. And I remember just sitting there watching it. I didn't think that the mayor of Toronto was a person of exceptional character. We'll say that. I didn't think he was one, but they weren't helping the situation because they were shaping how people should feel about the things that were going on with that guy. And it's one thing to go, this person has been accused of doing a thing, but then it's another to go, not even go, this person was accused of a thing. No, they definitely did this thing, and we should all join in making a public mockery of them. The public is going to do what the public is going to do. But one thing, and this is just me, I don't think that we should excessively try to guide what they're talking about and what the public cares about. Now, obviously, there's some exception to this because there's a certain expectation in certain aspects of game journalism where that runs counter to that, such as if you're a game reviewer, if you're reviewing products, you're going to say, well, I enjoyed this game, or I disliked this game, or I think that there's some issues, but some people may not have a problem with that. And so when you're reviewing games, people are specifically looking for your opinion, but it's also in the manner of which you deliver that opinion. And if you're a little too heavy-handed with what your stance is on that, people are going to call you on it. And they're going to say, just tell me what the experience was, not necessarily your take on it. And that's also been one huge component with what's been going on with games media.
All right, let's go away from this for a second here, because right now you actually brought up a good point, which was the whole, how certain things should be run, how certain things should be worked with. In your opinion, how do you think a game journalism company should operate?
As a baseline, I think that a game journalism, outlet should more or less operate in line with the SPJ's ethics code, just because it's a good minimal standard. Of course, there are certain differences that come along with being a part of a game enthusiast press. That means that video game journalism is going to have to make certain tweaks to those ethics standards. For example, if you look at the SPJ code, they say that you should always refuse monetary valued gifts, things like that. But then when you look at someone who says, I'm a game reviewer, and a company wants to go, hey, we want to make sure that you can review this title. We are going to provide you a copy of said title, not even hardware to play, but we want to make sure that you have it. It's available. We're even going to give that to you ahead of time with maybe a review embargo. You have to look at those things. And in that kind of stance where a retail game usually is valued around $50 to $60, the bare minimum that you need to cover the actual product, I think that that's generally okay. But it is important, and it is also part of our current government regulations, that you do have to disclose those type of I'm making air quotes right now, gifts to the general public. They have a right to know under what circumstances you're playing that. And from my own personal opinion, just looking at this stuff, I have seen in the past where someone just receiving a review copy or a code of a game will have an effect on their opinion and how they may perceive the value or the worth of a thing. When I was reviewing games, there was more than a few times where I had to pay out of my own pocket, to cover a game that I was going to review, and that had an effect on my opinion. And I kind of tried to always stick to that point of view of, imagine if I'd walked in the door and paid $50, $60 for this product. am I $50 or $60 worth of happy, I guess is the way that I say it. And when people disconnect from that and they forget about that part, I think that it has an effect. And I don't think that game reviewers realize, again, it has a huge long-term effect on the industry. When you sit down, you put out a score for a game, you're saying, nope, this isn't good. And I couldn't stand it. And I'm basically trying to convince my viewers, my readers, that this isn't worth their time to check out. And companies change their marketing strategies. They change their developing strategies just based on that stuff. I mean, we've heard multiple stories about how Metacritic has an effect on game development at large. And it's all that kind of stuff that we do have to keep in mind. Again, just talking about the baselines and understanding the things here, there are certain places where you're going to have to make little tweaks to the SPJ's code. But as a just, let's start from here, the foundation, and then we modify this slightly to meet the demands of our profession as game journalists and reviewers, I think that that's okay.
Okay. Let's talk about what's going to happen after SPJ, because a lot of people are saying that this is going to be, that the Airplay event is going to be the final nail in the Gamergate coffin. I'm air quoting. And some people are saying that after we're done with this, we change our narrative and we go somewhere else with this. And other people are saying that the argument will not end. What do you think is going to happen after Airplay?
After Airplay, this is a great question, because it's something I've tried to explain to people a little bit, why I think Airplay is so important. I think the big thing that is going to happen is that people are going to walk out of there and they're going to ask questions. And for people involved with Gamergate, they have been dealing with a certain type of personality, type of people over the past 10 months, and at that point it'll be a year. And for this group, they really, really hate when people ask questions. They hate when people go, well, wait a minute, let's think about this in a different way. They don't like that. And so to be in this situation where people leave Airplay, they don't have to leave going, oh, well, this is what Gamergate is about, and I'm 100% pro Gamergate now, and let's get the green and purple and all that stuff going. No, I don't think that they need to do that. They just need to go, how come no one has asked about this stuff? Why, how come this particular topic hasn't been further explored? Or how come people didn't hold this person a little bit more accountable with their claims and their allegations? There's just going to be so many who, what, when, where, and whys involved here. And I think that's the most powerful thing that can come from this. I think that we're going to suddenly start seeing a lot more reporting on the subject in a much more balanced fashion. It doesn't mean that suddenly all of the mainstream media is going to turn tail and go, oh, Gamergate is great, all that. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're going to see more editors go, maybe we need to go back and revisit this, especially in the case of just seeing how myself and the other panelists are and how we present ourselves and our information. I think they're going to become a lot more interested. I think that they're going to start examining their own failures within their own organizations and see where the breakdowns begin to occur, and going, well, maybe we do need a little bit more self-examination. I think that when outlets hear about all of this and they get the whole story, I think they're going to want to do everything possible to avoid their own Gamergate situation from jumping off at some point in the future.
Okay. And that's probably the most realistic answer I've heard about that in a while, because a lot of people just keep on saying it's going to end or it's just going to keep on going. And that's actually probably one of the better ones I've heard about that. I do have two more questions for you, but before I ask those questions, how do you feel about staying just a little bit longer for a public Q&A session?
Sure.
Okay, cool. What we'll do is, some people who are watching the live chat at the moment via YouTube, you can ask your questions on the chat page, on the chat associated with the YouTube link that is provided wherever you're watching it. Or you can also ask on Twitter, hashtag AskGJN. That's AskGJN. And whatever question you have for myself or Mr. Campbell on this stream. Next question. In relation to the end of Airplay, you made an announcement not too long ago that after the Airplay event, you were going to step away from Gamergate. Can you please elaborate on that?
Well, this was a tough decision that I started thinking on some months back. And, just as you said, I decided that once Airplay is over, I think that it's a bit kind of my time to step back. Gamergate as a whole, over the past year, and looking at it, obviously, for those just like yourself who've been around for such a long time, one thing we can say about Gamergate is that, or two things we can say about Gamergate, in fact, is that one, Gamergate has not been boring, and two, it can be very dramatic at times. You've got all kinds of people. You've got all kinds of personalities that have shown up and talked about this subject matter. And some people have become far more prominent and others became less prominent over time. Myself, when I first started talking about this stuff, I wasn't a particularly well-known person. When I even just, sat down and talked about this, I was like, I was a baby reporter in any sense of the word, just not being nearly as experienced as some others. But I've gained a type of prominence, and some people have told me I represent certain ideas for them, and realizing that there's a ton of responsibility that comes along with that. It's why I've had to make significant changes to my own life to accommodate that and make sure that I'm doing the very best that I could by Gamergate. When I just sit back and look at this stuff and realizing that the things that come out of my mouth will be considered a reflection of Gamergate itself. And I have to look at that and realize that, just as I said, whatever I say, that's going to be reflected back on Gamergate. And whatever I'm doing, Gamergate's opponents will take that and they will try to use it as a form of ammunition if they can against Gamergate. And so I look at that stuff and I realize just how much is on the line, and there are people depending on me. It has made my life very complicated in a myriad of ways. Something I've talked about just recently for the first time. I've been sitting on quite a bit of information in the sense that things that have happened with me that I didn't talk about prior because, well, it was either not relevant at the time, or it would just make things more complicated. But now I'm starting to talk about those things. And one of the things that I talked about is Gamer Ghazi, which is something that most people should be familiar with. With Gamer Ghazi, if you don't know what that is, Gamer Ghazi is basically the anti-Gamergate camp, or part of it anyway. I'm not going to say that comprises all of it because that's clearly not true. But way earlier on, as I was just digging through information sources and places where people were having discussions, one poster over at Gamer Ghazi on Reddit is someone who personally knows who I am, as it lives in my town, went to the same high school with me, and I had to watch this situation. I had to watch this conversation unfold over on Reddit, and watching these people grill him for everything that they could get out of him about me, and trying to spill details of my life and things like that. And at least in this point in time, if he's around and he's listening, I'd say, hey, thank you for just not doing that. Like, he kind of he put his foot down and he was like, I'm not going to do that. But I had to watch for that stuff. And that's one of the things that made this situation scary for me. Now, when I have to leave my house, knowing that there are Ghazi people who live in my town, and obviously knowing from personal relationships that I've had, and knowing that that's the case, I have to take a different stance on some of this stuff. when I leave my house, I have to be aware. That doesn't mean I'm walking around all paranoid with a trench coat up around my neck. No, I'm just saying I have to be really aware of the fact that who knows when someone is going to turn around and make a scene, in public, or start something. I'm a married man. I have to worry about my wife and how people may react to her or try to start an altercation with her regarding this stuff, because I've been so outspoken and public about it. Those are things that I do have to worry about and things I have to take into account. And that's one factor. Another factor is, I've done a lot within the space of Gamergate, and we've had, just as I started to say, we've had a lot of personalities, and we've had a lot of people do incredible work regarding Gamergate. With that, I think that it's kind of important that I don't become a person that people may perceive as, oh, this is his thing, he's taking things over, things like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, and being able to go, you did your work, you did the things that you promised that you would do and tried to get done, and to help with the specific aspect of it, and then being able to let that stuff go and let fresher faces step in and lead the charge, and let other people who are saying the same stuff that I am. And in fact, I know that there are people who are just a hell of a lot more smarter than me and bring up great points. These are the people that make me think, and they're not being heard. And I'm going, you should really be listening to this person, because I change my decisions based on the things that they're telling me, or they're presenting a different point of view. And I'd want to see more of those people start getting pushed forward more, just so that they can start getting that room to be heard, and their suggestions and their points of view, because it's really valid stuff. And sometimes there's even parts where someone is like, can you push this forward for me? And I look at this and I'm like, this is one of the smartest things I've ever heard. I've seen myself a few times get credit for things that I didn't come up with, and I'm like, hold on, that's not me. That wasn't me. Please don't attribute that to me. You need to give that proper attribution to the person who did that. Things like Not Your Shield. That was really weird to me. Like, I'm someone who is in Not Your Shield, just due to the nature of, well, I'm black, but looking at that, like, I know who created it. I know who are the people who started that hashtag. I mean, I did some work within Not Your Shield, and that's great, but people falsely credit me with that, and that's something I kind of want to start getting away from. The third and arguably biggest point on why I'm stepping away, like I said, not just general safety concerns, and getting more prominent people to the front. The biggest thing for me would be looking at this, and I'm trying to think of how to explain this in a real easy term. I didn't intend to be famous, and I'm making air quotes again, from Gamergate. There's other stuff that I do besides this. I'm a cyclist, I'm a fiction author, and those are like my two big things right now. And I was doing game journalism as well, and all these other things. And I think it's truly great that people rallied behind me, and they think that I represent an idea, and I represent something for them, and I give them a hell of a boost. But this wasn't exactly part of my plan to sit down and go, oh, you became famous because a bunch of other people in an industry that you worked in screwed up. That's the
Right.
easiest way to put it. And I want to make it, as far as fame or anything, or any kind of prominence, I guess would be the better term, because of what I did and what I accomplished, not because of someone else's error. And that's just me. That's just me kind of looking at this, and it's like, I don't feel like I've earned that. I don't think I've earned that right, I guess. And that's just my own personal convictions and things talking here. And I want people to pay attention to what I'm saying, not because everyone else is doing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I see that kind of stuff, happen all the time where it's like, well, nope, he said it and it can't be questioned. It's like, well, no, please, if you're paying attention to what I'm saying, it's because you agree with it, or because even if you don't agree with it, you're like, I really like the way you think outside of the box or anything like that. But not because, well, these people screwed up and we're having to fall back to the ragtag group of misfits to go and save the world. Like that kind of stuff. No. And I think it's going to be really telling when I step away from this stuff and see who's still there and who's like, I really enjoy you and the things that you do and the things that you talk about and your outlook on life. Um, I think that's what's important. That's just for me.
Okay. And uh, either way, still thank you for what you've been doing on both sides of this. Last question before we go to some of the questions we've received on Twitter. Um, Currently, you're actually doing a blog post, which is your personal history of Gamergate, but not. It's not about the ethics argument. It's not about any of the harassment. It's what you personally have been going through with Gamergate. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, that's something that I wanted to do. For a little bit of a while, and there have been multiple requests over the past 10 months from people like Milo Yiannopoulos is writing a definitive book on Gamergate, and I do believe Ethan Ralph, as most people know as the Ralph Retort, is going to also be writing a book on that. And I sat back and I looked at that, and one of my long-standing just again personal convictions is don't make money off of people's hardship. Over all this time, I, haven't monetized any of the videos that I've done. When I was doing Gamergate News Radio, the entire time, again, no monetization. I just did that on my own free time. I was doing something called Mandatory Fun, where I would just jump on Twitch and stream for hours on end. It's became a little bit of a meme, I guess, where me doing a 24-hour stream just because I felt like it was a pretty commonplace thing. And, obviously that's chewed into my personal funds a bit. Um, it's important to me that keeping people on track and keeping them focused and doing these things to give people a little bit of reprieve, give them downtime from the controversy. That stuff's really important to me because that's what I believe in. That's just the type of person that I am. And as I sat back and looked at this over the past couple of weeks, I was like, you're thinking about making this serious major exit, and I thought it was fair to just tell people in advance because we know how people can get. If I just poof disappeared off the face of the earth right after Airplay, people would begin making speculations. There would be all kinds of conjecture. People would assume this, they would presume that. And no, just for me going, hey, this is what's going to happen. And telling them in advance would give them fair warning. I can control the story of how that's going to go out and all that. And this is when I started talking about writing of my own personal experiences within Gamergate. The reason I'm doing that is because I think that it's important to get that particular point of view. Um, People have told me that they wanted to hear it. The next major thing is that there's a lot of stuff that I did do within the space of Gamergate, really major stuff that I basically had a significant hand in that I don't think people realize. And when I look at Gamergate, and I see the things that I know I had an effect on, and the things that originated from me in some way, shape, or form. It's really amazing to see, to just sit back and go, holy crap, I changed the world in a sense. And there are things, like I said, how my life has been affected by that stuff in ways that people don't know because I'm not saying in the public space. I'm not talking about it on Twitter or anywhere else. And I want people to kind of have an idea of what I was going through and why. I might have been experiencing those things. I also want people to have context of, well, what's Oliver doing in Gamergate? But then how's that kind of feeding off into his regular life? And then also how's my regular personal life bleeding back into Gamergate in that way? A couple of things that I have talked about already was just how I showed up. Like when I first heard about it, I was actually sitting here visiting from, or having someone visit from out of town that I used to do game journalism with, a fellow from Hard for Games. And we were just like kind of chilling here on the couch. And he was like, "Hey, have you heard about this Zoe post thing?" And I'm like, "Well, I kind of heard about it, but I didn't go digging into it." And he pulls up the Internet Aristocrat video, and we're just kind of sitting there watching in horror as we're hearing all this stuff go down. And that's just like how it opened up for me. And then talking about those earlier streams and seeing how that stuff came to fruition. The stuff that I haven't written about yet, but things that are coming, will be talking about things like OpUV, which was making the contact with the FTC and regarding paid affiliate links. Knowing that, I know how that all started because I'm one of the origin source points for that whole thing that went down. It's the kind of illumination that I think people will find interesting. Or deep freeze. Many people don't know that I was the one that came up with deep freeze, and we worked on that for months in advance. We started working on that in November, as when that actually came about, and then me getting to see deep freeze boom become what it is now and how much of an effect it has. That's the kind of stuff that I've been involved in, but it's just been very either low key or it's been lost in the greater conversation. And I think people knowing about that stuff would be really fascinating for them. And of course, I think that it would be educational as well. When I finish it, and I would hope that the finale of the book would be Airplay itself. But when I finish it, my intent will be to just go ahead and release it as an EPUB for free. Just give it out as if nothing else, an educational resource, because I would love to see journalism students sit down and look at this and examine a controversy or examine a scandal and get the information right from a key source, rather than having to hear about it from conjecture or people making up urban legends and all kinds of wild stuff. And Oliver Campbell dragged 25 goats up a mountain with only his pink in. No, like, let's just put a stop to all that.
I would believe that if I read that in a book. But
but that's the kind of stuff that I wanted to do with that. And I was like, well, this is a good idea. It gives me a place to share stuff with people that they hadn't heard about or things that they hadn't understood yet. And if people can take that and use that to deal with situations in the future and think about things a little bit differently, I think that it would be great.
Okay, a quick question, since you mentioned journalism students. We will go to the questions that are on Twitter, but do you think this is something that will be in journalism textbooks in the future?
Without a doubt. I absolutely think that it will. Simply because it's gone on for so long. The consequences have been massive. You don't have this kind of effect on an industry that's generating close to $100 billion, and someone doesn't write about it in a historical sense. It's the biggest entertainment industry in the world. The allegations and accusations that Gamergate have put forth are incredibly damning when you just look at them on the surface. And if nothing else, Gamergate is a how to not do your job well. And it's a great way to point out to students, in the sense of, if you don't want this stuff to happen, this is the stuff that you don't do. And if anything at all, Gamergate is a perfect illustration for journalism professors on, here's why we have ethics standards. Why? Because these kinds of situations happen when they become lax or non-existent.
Okay, excellent point on that. All right, so let's go to our questions we have on Twitter. First one comes from our friend John Smith, actually, at 38ch_John Smith. Would/could the SPJ put any pressure on the game journalists if they speak out against them?
I don't think that that's the case. The SPJ in and of itself isn't a watchdog, I guess would be the way to describe that. I mean, it is an association of journalists, and I know that there are some game journalists who are members. of the SPJ. What I think is going to happen is that you are going to see other journalists who are SPJ members and who are not connected to the industry. And this is just my current hypothesis of how this will happen. They will spend more time suddenly looking at the game industry and some of their own connections and professional relationships that they have with other reporters in games, in game journalism. And they're going to have to look at this stuff in a new way. And some people are either going to solidify their relationships and say, well, I'm just not going to touch this no matter what because you're my friend. And then you're going to have other people that are going to realize that they do have a duty to report these things and these happenings to the public. And I think what we're going to see is, because hopefully, that's the key word here, I said hopefully, you're going to see more mainstream reporters, even if they're not like big, huge, massive reach reporters. It might even just be small reporters, but I think they're going to come and start tackling the subject a little bit more carefully, a little bit more nuanced. And I think we're going to see them start talking about some of our key points. Deep freeze, just in and of itself, as a watchdog for just games journalism, is something that they would want to talk about and something that they would want to report on. And you're going to start hearing about these reporters that are featured on Deep Freeze, and they're going to be cast in a bad light, and they're not going to like that. I think that's what we're going to start observing more things like that, where looking at these things and looking at these situations. And I also think that journalists who have reported on Gamergate in the past already from more mainstream publications, such as Washington Post, for example, I think they're going to go back and they're going to look at the things that they've done before. And I think even a sense of shame might befall some people. That's something Koretsky kind of talked about, where oftentimes the professional embarrassment and professional shame is enough to get someone to stand by ethics standards and ethics policies. And I think that more than a few people within the mainstream media will feel like they've dropped the ball. And as other people see this stuff and take them to task, well, as they say, crap rolls downhill. And I think that if they're going to, be looked at in that way, they're going to make sure that other people also suffer a similar amount or even a lesser amount of embarrassment and shame in that sense.
Okay. Next question. We're actually gonna get this question. Oh, it's still on Twitter. We got at MegaMike1983. Can we see some sort of standard punishment / removal of bad apples if they're shown to break rules?
This was something, a discussion that I had recently. Way back at the beginning of Gamergate, there was discussion that it's pretty clear that there's this current thing that we're doing, it's not working, where standards are lax and there's just lots of room for abuse, things like that. And there was discussion of the idea of an ombudsman or, some type of game journalism watchdog by itself. And at the time, it was a bad idea because people were still very, very agitated. They were very, very frustrated. And the idea of, putting in something in place that, again, could have the potential of being corrupted by the very same people who were at the center of this situation, that's something that people didn't want to talk about and they didn't want to discuss. Just a few days ago, I went back to the idea and just said, I think this is something that in the future, again, is something that needs to be looked at and needs to be considered. And it's a potential, just in-game thing where we're going to have some sort of oversight, even if it's voluntary, in the sense of the ESRB, same way. And I think that it's important. I think that we need to start establishing some kind of serious legitimacy in the way that we go about covering video game news and just handling the journalism at large within the games industry, because it's already shown how bad it is. And the thing that scares me the most is we've seen all these things. We've seen plenty of horrifying things. We've seen tons of just really ugly allegations. We've seen horrible accusations. And these are just the things that we've seen. It's almost kind of like how, you might have a rash on your arm or something like that, but it's something beneath the surface of the skin that's causing it. And the things that we've seen that's surface stuff. And if it's this bad on the surface, I don't want to know. Hey, like, no, I actually do want to know, but you know what I mean. I'm just using the turn of phrase. I don't want to know what's going on underneath the surface, the things that we haven't seen, or the things that we can't account for, or the things that we haven't discovered. That scares me more. And that's the stuff that we're going to have to address. And I would hope that not Gamergate in its sense, because Gamergate is a reaction to a scandal, but I would hope that one of the longer term consequences is that there is a way to start having um, a bit of that personal oversight with, a third party intermediary, I guess would be the way to describe that, where, a standalone just game journalism watchdog that's not different than any other media watchdogs that we have in the UK or we even have here in the United States. And they specifically deal with covering things like bias and unethical reporting and stuff like that. And people do report to those things. You've got regular people in the public who go, hey, here's some stuff going on. Would you go take a look at this? And of course, there's different ways to go about doing it and how they handle those situations, but I think it's a potential step. And so I would hope that people at least start reevaluating that again and even start thinking about it and finding out, well, where are the pitfalls? Where are the issues? Where are the problems? Way back in the day, I told Gamergate, sometimes we're going to have ideas and some of them are good, some are great, some are bad, and some are just flat out terrible. But we have to start throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks and then start picking apart our own ideas before we kind of get into things. And I think a similar thing, such as a game journalism legitimate watchdog or ombudsman or whatever you want to call it, would that people would start having that conversation and going, well, here's the things that could go wrong. Just as I said with, how ethics are, like either something could go wrong or something has gone wrong. And I think that this is an idea that should also be examined in a similar way.
Okay. Excellent points. Next question is actually on the YouTube chat that's going on from Ravener. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. If the SPJ, very theoretically speaking, would condemn the behavior of the gaming journalists from Polygon, etc., does this actually exert any pressure on them?
I think so, yes. When you've got one of the, again, you've got the one of the biggest journalism associations in the country going, just again, we're operating off a theory. Let's say if they come out and they're just like, oh man, these guys are rotten to the core. Well, yeah, that's going to make a huge effect. And turn around and just going like they are, twisted, they're twisted more wacky than a crazy straw. Like when you look at that and you've got other journalists saying stay away from this journalist because they're antithesis of everything that we should be doing in this profession, yeah, your professional credibility is going to be shot in a way that you don't want messed up. Like that's the thing you don't want to happen.
And we kind of saw this at E3 this year.
Yes. Hearing about certain journalists being turned away by members of the industry. People should know this one. For example, with Kotaku not being invited to the Ubisoft presser for their big before E3 show, that was telling. And going that for whatever reason, Ubisoft has finally hit their point where they're done with that outlet. And when you have pressure coming from inside the game industry itself of why are we putting up with this? Like, wait, under what obligation do we have to actually let you come into our house, spit on our shoes, slap the dog and all that, and then feed you afterwards? No, they don't have to. And I think people are just now starting to catch on to that idea. They're like, wait a minute, I don't have to deal with you. If I don't want to, I don't have to. If you're going to report on us, fine, but you're going to have to do your own legwork at that point, And you've got that pressure coming from inside the industry. Gamergate has many game developer allies, obviously, such as Brad Wardell. You've got Mark Kern. You've got a myriad of smaller independents. I've been involved in a few anonymous interviews. I can tell you they come from big development studios, the kind where, midnight openings happen because of these companies putting out stuff. That's the kinds of people that I've been talking to, and they are all, for the most part, in agreement over the basic stuff with Gamergate, and the base stuff being about, the ethical concerns and how their industry is affected by these people's reporting, and how their careers are again, as I said, affected by someone else's messed up ethical standards. So you've got those allies on that side, and then you turn to the right, and hopefully, if we do this right with Airplay, you'll have many other journalists going, the journalists over there are really, really, really sketchy, and you don't want to be associated with those folks. That hurts their career even more. And then from the third vector, you have Deep Freeze that is pointing this stuff out. So you basically have to, I guess, borrow from a Chrono Trigger. I mean, you've got a triple raid here. You've got Chrono coming from the left, you got Frog from the right, and you've got Robo coming up the middle. I mean, that's a bad way to be. I would start cleaning up your house and making sure that your skeletons in your closet are all pristine and taken care of, because people are going to go look.
Right, and it's even also holding yourself accountable for your actions. Some people are trying to make a stance on that. Some people are trying. Not everybody is doing that, unfortunately. And I think if some people were to come forward and say, yeah, I screwed up, yeah, I did this, yeah, I did that, I think people can start coming to an understanding and maybe give that person a second chance if they do seem genuine about it. And we kind of saw that with Arthur Chu when he apologized. Some people were like, well, okay, but they kind of kept themselves a little distant, but they acknowledged the fact that he apologized.
Right. We've had big stuff like that happen, where major things have happened to people in Gamergate and they're not reported. And we'll be able to talk about that stuff at Airplay when, obviously with Gamergate in DC, and having that meetup with Milo Yiannopoulos and Christina Hoff Summers, and just a ton of people came out for that. I think it was over 200 people. And then someone calls in a bomb threat to people on Gamergate, and people went out of their way to avoid reporting on that. And that alone, that situation right there, again, is telling. And, I looked at that situation and I said, wait a minute. So this is something concerning video games, because, well, that's what those people are there for, talking about, games in the game industry. A bomb threat, a credible bomb threat, according to the FBI, that reported on it, because the FBI was the one that tipped off the Metro DC police. And people had to evacuate. People had to leave. They had to send in the bomb sniffing dogs and all that stuff. This happened in our nation's capital. So
Right.
you've got three major components to this story, and you're trying to tell me that no one thought that was newsworthy? No, that's probably one of the most newsworthy things that has happened in video games. Like, you don't call in threats to the nation's capital and go, it's not a big deal, we don't need to report on it. No, you kind of talk about that stuff because, well, I don't know what was going on in that person's head. Whoever did that, I don't know who it was, and I'm not going to say that it was Antes. I'm not going to say that it was Gamergate. I'm not going to say it was neutral or even a third party. We don't know just yet. I'm sure we'll find out at some point, but that's still up in the air. But the fact remains, someone had to have not been in their right mind to go, yeah, I'll fake a bomb threat, on, again, the nation's capital. It'll be fine. Like, oh, you gotta have a disturbed train of thought to think that that would just go over fine. But that's the kind of stuff that has been very poorly reported on. You've got things like people in Gamergate actually coming to Anita Sarkeesian's defense when people were making active death threats against her. And even Kotaku itself did report on that. Jason Schreier did. And now it's very, very low key. That's the kind of stuff that I'm going to talk about, where there's a very specific campaign to paint Gamergate in a specific kind of shape. And the fact is, Gamergate is not that shape. It's not even close to that. That's the kind of stuff that's going to come out at Airplay. And I think that with the mainstream media, those who are in attendance, I think they're going to look at this, and I've got a few plans hidden in my back pocket still of things that I'm going to do to make sure that Airplay goes great in that sense. I think they're going to walk away from this and they're going to see they're going to finally see the huge chunks of the story that they've been missing, and they're going to want to know why other reporters didn't talk about those things. They'll be like, well, wait a minute, this is true. They're handing me information that says that this is true from third-party sources, not even their own camp, or trying to push an agenda. No, just this stuff happened. Why didn't anyone talk about it? And it's going to be incredible.
Right. Quick correction. It was A. Miles Chung, not Arthur Chu. I've just been told that. Got this confused. My mistake. Quick correction on that. Last question. And this is actually to both of us. And it's actually not 100% related to Gamergate, but it does have to do with ethics and journalism in general. And this is from my Loserville. Who do you think will win the Gawker versus Hogan case? Personally, I think both sides have already lost the situation. Gawker, because, well, there was a breach of ethics there. They were not thinking ethically about this whole situation. And unfortunately for Mr. Hogan, because by bringing attention to this, he essentially strives to end affect this entire thing. So now more people are unfortunately seeing an embarrassing situation. What about your rebuttal on this, Mr. Campbell?
You know, I've been looking into that and studying that in a really neat way. And this is something that I didn't talk about. This is something I hadn't told people yet, so I'm going to go ahead and say it here. What I sat down and read about, Gawker, I actually made a post about this on Twitter, following the journalism professor that the journalism professor that is I'm trying to think of the word. I'm sorry. He's not providing advice, but he's on that case on Hogan's side, examining this stuff. And he basically came out and said that, Gawker doesn't really care about ethics. It's all about money for them. And, that was just amazing to sit down and watch, because, well, now you have a professor of journalism saying the exact same thing that Gamergate has been saying for going on close to a year now. But what I did was, I went and did some research into him, and, it turns out, oh, look at that. Well, he's down in, Miami. He's right down there in Florida. In fact, that professor is an advisor for the SPJ. And so I went ahead and reached out to him just to see if he was going to be at Airplay, at least to attend and see the things that we have to say about that. I haven't heard back yet, but I would be really keen on meeting him, considering that the things that we're talking about are absolutely relevant to the case at hand with that. I think Gawker will likely lose in the sense of the public's need to know. One thing that I took a look into and did additional research into is how dealing with public figures and the things that can get you a lawsuit, laid at your feet, even as a journalist. Just because you have the freedom of the press and you have free speech, you can still run afoul of the law. And I think people sometimes don't realize that there's a certain amount of prying that is into someone's personal life that is off limits in the legal sense. And that's what the Hogan case is basically centered around. Like, it's one thing to say Hulk Hogan made a sex tape. We've seen it. We have it. That's one thing. You can get away with saying that, and that's all that it would be. That's all it says. But them distributing that, you've run afoul. You've stepped over the line potentially of the public's need to know. As in, that's going too far. They don't need to be right in the bedroom seeing the guy's butt cheeks and all that other stuff. Like, time out. Like that oversteps your freedom of the press. And then the next part of that you have basically just kind of comes back to Gawker's history. They're closer to a tabloid than anything else at this point. And I think that's going to be a pretty significant factor of seeing what they're doing and failing to abide by other things. Like one thing that they talked about with the Hogan case is that technically he does have copyright over that work because, well, it was one can argue that it's a creative work and the people featured in that work in question would hold a certain amount of legal rights over that, and the distribution of that stuff does violate, well, his copyright. And so when you look at those different things, I don't think Gawker is going to come out on top here. I mean, they're going to try. They're going to make great effort, and they've done enough damage to other people and other careers, things like that. There's inconsistencies in how they go about reporting. Like, they're perfectly fine. For example, here's Hulk Hogan's sex tape. We're going to distribute that. But then when other stuff happens, like I'm sure people are familiar with I'm making air quotes right now, the fappening, which was a distribution of several major actresses and other public figures, personal nude photos and things like that. And they took a hard stance of, no, you shouldn't be looking at this and you shouldn't distribute that. It's very hypocritical.
Hypocritical of them right there.
Right. And so when you look at that stuff, I think that stuff is going to end up being a factor in whether or not, Gawker wins or loses that thing. And just based on that stuff on the surface, I don't think they're going to.
Yeah, because I mean, if I was to take a lawyer stance on that, I would ask that question. You said this in the past. You said that this is a bad thing. You just did this. Well, what's the difference in the situation? And if I was a lawyer, I would love to ask that question to them. But again, I'm a journalist, so I got to ask, other questions instead. Anyway, Mr. Campbell, thank you so much for joining me for this interview. What's the website where people can read your blog about Gamergate right now?
If they want to continue on just following with my own story about what I've dealt with and what I've experienced in Gamergate, it's actually the book of Gamergate.wordpress.com. When I finish it, just to let people know in advance, it's not actually going to be called the Book of Gamergate. Like when I started writing it, I was just like, I don't even know what to call this. Just check and see if the URL is available. And I was like, oh, look, it is. And that was it. I do have some about stuff up on there, just answering those questions like, well, is this about Gamergate itself? I'm like, well, no, it's about, framed within the context of my own life and what I was doing, what was going on at that time, and just getting that personal perspective. As I'm writing it out, like it's being written in blog posts or for each chapter. And then as I said, it will be compiled together into a proper ebook. And distributed in EPUB format. And if I can pull it off, I'd like to get it up on Amazon and just make it free. There are ways to go about doing that, and so I want to make sure that people have access to that and they can kind of read into that and hopefully learn something about it.
Awesome, and thank you very much for that. Also, you'll be at the Airplay event on August 15th in Miami, Florida, correct?
In Miami, Florida, that is correct. One thing I'd like to talk about, though, regarding that is that I do understand that there's going to be another Gamergate meetup immediately after Airplay. And as far as I can tell, I will be attending that event down there in Miami. So, I've been fighting for a lot of people and a lot of upset people who have every right to be upset and disappointed and let down in the media that is supposed to represent them. And I'd really like to see all of your faces.
Will do, and we'll like to see you in person there too. Anyway, thank you very much. That was me interviewing Oliver Campbell for Game Journalism Network. I'm Aaron Pabone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.